Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the very strange case of James Fox and the murder of Mary Fox, which took place in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1865. This may not end how you expect it to. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to also add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. The backstory for those involved is sadly again quite basic. James Fox was born in Ireland in around 1816 and was around 49 years old at the time the crime was committed. His parents are unknown. James worked as a hawker selling brushes, and he travelled the area selling these. He was married to Mary, and the couple had 5 children, 2 of whom still lived at home. And it was said for a time that James had been a teetotaler, but had recently been known as quite a heavy drinker. Mary Fox, the victim, was also born in Ireland in around 1821 and was around 45 years old at the time of her death, although some news articles suggest that she was a little older. She lived in Newcastle with James and worked as a hawker selling baskets around the streets of the town, which she made at home with the help of 2 of her older children, and she was also known to be quite a heavy drinker. And it would seem that whatever James would earn from selling his brushes, he kept for himself, and Mary had to pay for the house and the children from the money that she earned making and selling her baskets, and this would often cause arguments between the couple. On the night of March 19th, both James and Mary had been out selling their goods in Newcastle. When James returned home a little after Mary, he asked her to make him a meal. Mary, it seems, did not wish to make him anything to eat, and the couple then argued about this on and off for several hours, and both had been drinking, and Mary left the house several times to go to the local pubs before coming home and resuming the argument, and by around 11 p.m. the argument got much worse. Neighbours who heard the couple said Mary cried out, "Murder! Police!" But they did not take much notice, as this was something that happened all the time, so it was usually ignored by anyone who heard the couple. James by now was very angry, and he took hold of his wife and struck her on the face and nose with his fist. He then grabbed the pan that the food should have been cooked in and hit her on the head with it. Mary immediately fell to the floor. Their younger son, who had been in bed at the time, was too afraid to do anything, but he left the house in search of his brother Patrick to ask him to come home. Patrick, however, did not come home until around half an hour later, and on finding his mother lying on the floor, he cried out that she was dead. He then went in search of his older brother James Jr., who, on arriving at the house and seeing his mother, quickly went in search of a policeman, and James Sr., suddenly realising what he had done, went over to Mary and tried to pick her up off the floor. PC Telford was on duty close by and was the first to arrive. He felt that Mary was already dead, but he still sent for a doctor, who arrived a short time later, and the doctor immediately knew that Mary was dead and had been so for some time. The room was by now crowded with neighbours who, on hearing the commotion of the police and the doctor arriving, had come to see what was going on. Some of them had helped to lift Mary onto the bed. James was by now very upset, unable to let his wife go. He held her in his arms for some time, not believing that she was dead. PC Telford asked him to let go of her body, and he then arrested James on suspicion of the murder of his wife Mary, to which James replied, "I deny it." He was then taken to the police station. The inquest took place at the police courts at Newcastle before Coroner Hoyle. It was not stated who had identified the body of Mary Fox. However, the jury all went to her home in Bailiffgate to view the body, as was often the case if the inquest was not held in the same location. The first witness was to be their younger son Francis. However, it was stated he was unable to take the oath as he did not understand what it meant, so therefore he was unable to give his evidence, which probably went in favour of James, as Francis had been the only one to see what had happened in the house that night. Patrick Fox said he lived with his parents and younger brother Francis in Newcastle. He said on the night of the crime at around 11:30 p.m, Francis had come looking for him and asked him to return home. However, he said he did not go until around 12:15 a.m, thinking that this was nothing more than one of his parents' usual arguments. But on entering the house, he said he found his mother lying on the floor next to the bed, and his father was sitting calmly in the chair beside the fire, and Francis was in bed with the covers over him. He went over to his mother and was shocked to find she was not breathing and her skin was cold to the touch. He spoke to his father, who told him, "Your mother is there on the floor sleeping." He said he told his father she was not sleeping, she was dead, and accused him of killing her. He said his father replied by saying, "If I have done any harm, then I am ready to answer for it." Patrick said he then went to look for his older brother James, leaving his father trying to lift Mary off the floor. At this point, James Sr. spoke, saying, "I did think she was sleeping. I never raised a hand to injure her." Patrick continued by saying that when he returned to the home with his brother, they found James Sr. holding his mother in his arms. Patrick said they sent his father out of the house, but he came running back in. He was very upset. Patrick said James Jr. then went to find a policeman. He continued by saying that his father seemed to be very drunk that night. His mother, who he said rarely drank, had also been drunk earlier that night when he had seen her in one of the public houses in Newcastle. He said he could only see the injuries to his mother's face and nose and did not see any marks on the top of her head. And when asked, he said his parents were often known to argue and would frequently hit each other with anything they could find, and most of their arguments were usually over money. Isabella Burke said she lived in Bailiff Gate in Newcastle and knew Mary well. However, she said she knew nothing of the crime that had taken place. But she had spent some time with Mary earlier that evening, and although she said they had had a drink together, she did not feel that Mary was drunk. She said James returned home sometime between 6 and 7 p.m. and bought potatoes and fish for Mary to cook. She said she did not see Mary again after 8 p.m, but she heard the couple arguing, and it seemed to be about the food. Mary, she said, was refusing to cook, and James called her several bad names. She said she believed that James had been drinking when he arrived home, but she did not think that he was drunk either. When asked, she said she believed that Mary had asked James for some of his money, but he had refused to give her any, and she thought this was the reason why Mary had refused to make him a meal, and of course this had caused the argument between them that night. Catherine Errington said she lived in the room above the Foxes in Newcastle. She said on the night in question she had passed the Foxes' door at around 11 p.m. She could hear them inside, and she said she stood for a few moments to listen, and she heard Mary say, oh dear," several times. She didn't hear any more and went on her way to a neighbour to fetch some flour, and on her return she passed their door again and all was quiet. She continued saying a little after midnight she heard someone shouting in the street, so she opened the window and looked out. She shouted down to ask who it was, and was told it was James Fox, and he said to her, "My father has killed my mother." She said she went immediately with her husband down to the Fox's room. She met James Sr. in the passage on the way down, and he was wringing his hands and saying, "Whatever have I done?" She said on entering the room she found it full of the other neighbours, and she said Mary Fox appeared to her to have been placed on a chair with her head flung back. She was certain when she saw her that she was dead. She said she did not hear James Sr. say any more, and she said she did not believe James Sr. had been drunk when he had spoken to her earlier. She was asked whose voices she had heard in the room when she'd passed earlier, and she said she heard Mary and she thought she had heard James Sr., but she definitely heard a little boy say, "Oh mother, oh my mother," and she assumed this must have been Francis. At this point, James Fox Sr. spoke to Catherine, asking her if she was sure she had heard an argument that night, to which she said yes. He then asked if she had heard any sound of him hitting his wife, to which she said she had not. P.C. Telford said he had been on duty in Newcastle on the night of the crime, and at around 12:30 a.m. James Jr. came to him and told him of an incident at his parents' home, and he went with him to their house. He said that from the information provided by the son, he had taken James Sr. into custody on a charge of causing the death of his wife, Mary. He said James Sr. had said, "I deny it," and that he later added, "She came in drunk and fell on her face on the floor." P.C. Telford said he did not say any more after this. P.C. Telford said he later returned to the house and carried out a search of the room. He found no evidence of drink in the house, and the only thing that he found was a pot by the fireplace containing uncooked potatoes. Surgeon Septimus Rain said he had performed the post-mortem on the body of Mary Fox. He said externally there were very few signs of violence. She had a small scratch behind one ear, which he felt was nothing, and a bruise on her forehead that he believed had been caused by a fist. Internally, however, there was a large build-up of blood on her brain, and this, he said, had been the cause of her death. He believed this could have been caused by a blow to the head, or by her hitting her head on something hard if she had fallen. John Burke said he lived in Bailiff Gate in Newcastle, and he had known both James and Mary Fox. He said he was in their home on the night of the crime at around 8 p.m. He was there when James came home. He could not say if James was drunk, as he himself was the worse for drink that night, and was not able to remember much at all. He said he did, however, recall James and Mary arguing, and that it had come to blows, and he had got between them to stop them hitting each other. He said he remembered that when James sat down after their fight, he had blood coming from the top of his head. At this point, Dr. Rain was asked to examine James to see if there was a wound on his head, which was done, and the doctor said there was a very small scratch there, which, in his opinion, would not have bled much at all. John then continued, saying he had asked James who had caused the wound to his head, and he had told him that Mary had done it. And when asked, he said he did not see many blows exchanged between James and Mary before he stopped their fight, and he did not see Mary with anything in her hands that would have caused the cut on James's head. The coroner briefly spoke to the jury, stating that from the evidence given, he felt the only verdict could be one of manslaughter. The jury retired for half an hour, and on their return, they came with a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against James Fox, and he was committed for trial. The funeral of Mary Fox took place on Tuesday, March the 21st, 1865, at St. Nicholas's Churchyard in Gosforth. It was said that a large crowd had gathered outside of her home, and that many of those present had also followed the procession to the cemetery. No further details of the funeral were given, and I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Mary in the churchyard. Normally at this point we would move on to the trial. However, when the magistrates reviewed the case prior to the trial, they decided to throw it out. James Fox was then brought up before the magistrates, and the prosecution offered no evidence, and James was discharged and allowed to go back to his home. I was not able to find any further details of James after this date. This was a very confusing story. I have struggled to understand why the case did not go to trial, based on the evidence from the young son that his father did indeed hit his mother with a pan, and that it was after this that she had died, but it seems there simply wasn't enough evidence. The young son, it seems, was also not able to give his evidence, and no one else saw the crime take place, so this must have left the prosecution with little to work with. But I still find it odd that it did not go to trial, as other similar cases did, and they resulted in either a not guilty or several months in prison. I believe that the couple did argue a lot and were perhaps guilty of attacking each other on many previous occasions, both drinkers and not likely to know what they were doing at times, so it seems that this lifestyle would inevitably lead to one or the other of them dying from their injuries, and sadly in this case it was Mary. And was James entirely blameless in regard to his wife's death? Well, I honestly don't think he was. But what do you think? Do you think the magistrates were correct throughout the case, or do you think James should have been tried for manslaughter? Do you think he really did hit her with a pan as the young son suggested, or is it possible she simply fell and hit her head as James suggested? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.